All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm currently on the web forums working with user data, and I'm up to the UI Pseudo Classes, which is number 9, I believe, of 11. So, as they mentioned in previous articles, we covered styling of various form controls in a general manner. Some of the pseudo controls were introduced. For example, the colon checked to target a checkbox only when it is selected. In this article, as it says, we will explore in detail the different UI pseudo classes available to us in modern browsers for storing different states. So, what pseudo classes are available? All right, the original pseudo classes relevant to all forms. Hover, which is an important one if you take your mouse and you put it over something. Focus, when something has the focus. All right, and active, when an item is being activated. In other words, when it's being clicked on or when it's highlighted and you press enter or return. It says these basic pseudo classes should be familiar to you now. All right. But there have been more that have been added, and as it says, these are some of the ones that they're going to be looking at now. Required and optional, valid, invalid, in range, out of range, enabled, disabled, read-only, read-write, checked, indeterminate, and default. It says there are many others too, but the ones listed are the ones you're probably going to come across most often. All right, some of the others, as it says, are aimed at solving specific niche type of problems or not very well supported in browsers yet. So, all right, so a number of the classes, it says, discussed here are concerned with styling form controls based on their validation state. And they mention there you will learn more about this in the client-side form validation, which is the next article. But for now, they're not really going to get into the form validation because they haven't discussed it in any depth or breadth of coverage as of yet. All right. Styling inputs based on whether they are required or not. One of the most basic concepts in regards to client-side form validation is whether or not a form is required. Now, how do you handle that? Well, sometimes what happens is if an element is required, let's assume not all elements are required. All right. So if you want elements that are required, what you oftentimes do is you put a span to the side of the element or under the element or something else. And if they leave that off, that span, which would have not been displaying, will now display with a message that oftentimes is red and or bold or whatever. That's one way you can handle it. Also, what people do is they go back and then they highlight the field. And pink is usually a pretty popular color, that if you left off a required field, you might take one or all of those fields and make them pink. All right, so it says input, select, and text area elements have a required attribute that when set means that the control form must successfully submit. So it says here the last name and first name and last name are required, but email is optional. You can match these two states using the required and the optional pseudo classes. So you'll notice here, if I click submit, all right, you get this, please fill out this field. And if I put in that, now I get please fill out this field. Now if I do it again, since that last field wasn't required, it's okay. It says you can also try to submit the form without filling anything in to see the different error message. Those are the default error messages. And it says the above isn't bad, but it's not great either. For a start, we are signaling required versus optional using color alone, which isn't great for colorblind people. Second, the standard convention for web status is to put an asterisk or the word required or both on the controls in question. In the next section, it says there we will generate a better example indicating required field using the colon required pseudo class, which also digs into using generated content. It says you'll probably not find yourself using the optional one very often because most form controls are optional by default. So you're just putting something that's kind of superfluous or redundant on top of something you already have. Note, if one radio button in a name group has the required attribute, all buttons will be invalid until one is selected, but only the one with the attribute assigned will actually match the required. Okay, so let's jump ahead here. In previous articles, we've seen the use of generated content, but we thought this would be a good time to talk about it in detail. The idea is that we can use the : before and : after pseudo elements along with a content property to make a chunk of content appear before or after an affected element. The chunk of content is not added to the DOM, so it's invisible to screen readers. It is part of the document styles. Because it is a pseudo element, it can be targeted with styles the same way that an actual DOM node can be. This is really useful, as it says there, when you want a visual indicator to an element such as a label or icon, but don't want it picked up by assistive technologies. For example, it says in this example, all right, we use generated content to handle the placement and the animation of the inner circle when the button is selected. So what they're showing there, you may or may not have noticed, is by default this isn't red. Plus, watch, if you look, it kind of fades in. All right, gets real big and then it gets smaller type of an idea. Again, this is really useful when you want to add a visual indicator for an element. So we're not talking about using this with screen readers. It says this is really useful. Screen readers already let their users know when a radio button or checkbox is checked or selected, so you don't want them to read out another DOM element aloud, which makes sense. Back to our required optional example from before. This time we'll not only alter the appearance of the input itself, we'll use generated content to add an indicated label. All right, so this is the one we saw before. Notice it says on both of these required. Boom. And again, I can put anything I want to put in here. I can put 1, 2, 3. And the system has no way of knowing unless I put in what are called regular expressions when I check for only letters, etc. But it'll take this. It has no problem with that. First of all, we'll add a paragraph to the top, and then you saw that required fields are required. Since form inputs don't directly support having generated content on them because generated content is placed relative, you've seen some of that before, we'll add an empty span to generate the contents. I've done this kind of thing quite often myself. All right, and you'll see examples of it in the class. All right, the immediate problem with the span was dropping onto a new line below. So you get around that. It says we get around that with using some flex and the like. All right, so now, again, still works. If I leave it off, it still works a lot like it did before. All right, styling controls based on whether or not their data is valid. So as it says, this is a little more closer to the idea of what I mentioned to you of using regular expression handling. So it says the other really important fundamental concept in form validation is whether the form's data is valid or not. In the case of numeric data, for example, you can also talk about in range or out of range. Form controls with constraint limitations can be targeted based on these values. So as it says, you can use the : valid and : invalid. Now, I don't want to sit and read this to you, but you can take a look at what's there. All right. So no constraint will always be valid. Well, that should make some sense. All right. And there's ways that you can work with this stuff. So it says, let's look at the valid, invalid example here. So notice if I try, let's see if I put in 1, 2, 3 there. It still looks at it as being valid. All right, so I'll put in Jeff, I'll put in Scott, and let's try putting in 1, 2, 3 here. And now we get please include that. The 1, 2, 3 is missing the @ sign. What if I put in @ hello .com. Well, it looks like it passed then. All right. But you can see that right now these are got an X, meaning they're not passing right now. This one, since it's not mandatory, it's not required, will pass unless you put something in it that's invalid. All right. And this is the example. All right, in-range and out-of-range data typically will apply to something that's numeric in nature, and that should make sense. So the numeric input types, it deals with date, month, week, time, date, time, local, number, and range. All right, so it says let's look at this out-of-range example. I like this example right here because notice, all right, it is using the number thing, but if I come in here now and say Jeff, and I put in, let's just say must be 12 or above, I'm going to leave it blank and I'm going to click submit and I get a please fill out this field. I'm going to put in 10 and notice what I get. Value must be greater than or equal to 12, plus I get that message there. And let's face it, when you are working with people who don't have a visual impairment, there's only so much you can do. So in other words, what if I come in here and I put in this? Well, it says outside of the allowable range. Well, that's good. How about this? That's outside. So is that. All right. So it looks like what? 120 is the biggest age you can put in there. That might make a lot of sense. All right. But all of this stuff has to be used in conjunction with everything else that you're doing. All right. It is possible for the numeric input to be both required and out of range at the same time. So what happens then? Because the out of range appears later in the code than the required, the cascade rules come into play, and the last one in wins, which is the out of range. It says this works quite nicely. When the page first loads, required is shown, and if you put in something out of range, it changes. To enter an invalid out of range, you have to actually focus the form and type it in using the keyboard. The spinners don't allow you to go outside of the range because they've got a min and a max associated with them. We've talked about this before. All right. Looking in here, I may be able to finish all of this in one tape. We'll see. So styling enabled and disabled inputs and read only and read write. All right, so they've got some stuff in here. And let's just take a look at the example, okay? All right, so notice shipping and billing. Now this makes a lot of sense. So if I come in here with a name, Jeff Scott, I'd like to do that because that actually is. So let's put in here 751 North Parr Road. All right, 63385 would be the right zip code. All right, so if it's the same as the one here, all right, notice if it's not, now I can put that in. If it is the same, how that grays out. So you can see there are a lot of uses for this stuff. Read only and read write kind of make the same kind of sense. So here's an example here. So notice, send it by this. Notice if I put in here, that's the only time I'm able to put something in. But if I check that, I'll try it again. If I check this, if I uncheck it, I'm surprised. I thought that maybe it would have to be checked for me to put the final instructions in there. All right, so amend details, submit. All right. All right. Like I said, much of the material in here, especially when you're first starting this stuff, it's not going to be exactly relevant. Let's face it, when you're first starting and you're doing a lot of this, you're more concerned with getting it to work and have it look halfway decent. All right, this is some fairly advanced stuff in here. Radio and checkbox states, check, default, and indeterminate. Default matches what's checked by default. Indeterminate when radio's checkbox are neither checked nor unchecked. That would be indeterminate. So checked, as it says, when checked, they will be matched by the :check pseudo class. All right. So as it says, you can try that out here. We've already looked at this example. Default and indeterminate. Notice again, that's the default. Now that doesn't change, but you can still change it. And this means again that if you choose nothing, this is chosen by default. Notice as it says, there's also an example on their GitHub page. All right. Now this has got the little border on it. And you'll notice when you click one, it goes away on the other ones. But when you first start out, you get that. All right, and there are other interesting examples, as they say. More pseudo classes as we finish this one up. There are a number of other ones. Focus within, focus visible, placeholder shown, blank, user valid, invalid, etc. And there's plenty more to choose from. So we've now gone through the first 9 of these. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about client-side form validation in just a couple moments.